The days that followed the storm did not move in straight lines. Time at base camp had a way of folding in on itself, stretching into long, suspended hours of recovery and then snapping forward in sudden bursts of activity. Ernie woke often in the night, his ribs wrapped tight with bandages that smelled of the antiseptic the Pakistani medic used, his hands wrapped in gauze that hid the white tips of his fingers where the frostbite had begun to heal. The doctors had told him he would keep all of them, which was more than some men who walked off mountains could say. The fingers would be sensitive for a long time, prone to cold, prone to pain, but they would work. They would hold ropes. They would hold his daughter's hand. That was enough. He spent the first full day after the rescue in a haze of sleep and waking, the tent walls pressing close around him, the sounds of the camp filtering through the fabric like distant music. He heard the voices of the Pakistani soldiers, their language flowing in rhythms he was beginning to recognize, the sharp consonants and rolling vowels no longer foreign but familiar. He heard Rico's laugh, that bright, infectious sound that had carried them through so many dark hours in the Cordilleras. And he heard Junjun's voice, quieter now, steadier, the voice of a boy who had walked into a storm and walked out a man. The young Filipino had become something on that mountain, had found a part of himself that he had not known existed, and Ernie could hear it in the way he spoke, the way he moved around the camp, the way he checked on the Pakistani soldiers with the same quiet attention he had once reserved only for his own team. On the second day, Ernie forced himself out of the tent. The sun was blinding, the sky a deep, impossible blue that seemed to go on forever. The peaks that had tried to kill them now stood silent and majestic, their flanks white and pure, their summits lost in the clarity of the air. It was hard to look at them without feeling a strange mix of awe and something else, something that was not quite fear and not quite anger. Respect, perhaps. The same respect a boxer has for the opponent who has knocked him down. He walked slowly, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel, his ribs protesting with every step. The camp was smaller than he remembered, just a cluster of tents and a makeshift kitchen where a Pakistani cook was preparing a meal over a stove that hissed and sputtered in the thin air. The smell of rice and lentils drifted toward him, and his stomach growled, reminding him that he had not eaten properly in days. He found Imran sitting on a large flat rock at the edge of the camp, his back to the tents, his face turned toward the mountain. The young soldier was wearing a thick wool sweater over his uniform, and his head was bare, the thin mustache that had once seemed so mocking now just a part of a face that Ernie had seen in its most vulnerable moment. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle the man, but Imran must have heard him coming because he turned and offered a small, tired smile. There was a bruise spreading across his cheekbone, purple and yellow, a gift from the ice at the edge of the crevasse. He gestured to the rock beside him and Ernie sat. For a long time neither spoke. They had used up all the necessary words in the storm, had said everything that needed to be said in the grip of hands and the press of bodies against the cold. Words now felt like too much or too little. So they sat in silence, two men who had held each other on the edge of death, watching the mountain that had tried to claim them. Ernie pulled out his phone. There was still no signal, but the photo of Luz and Isabella was still there, the same one he had looked at 100 times since leaving Manila. He held it so Imran could see. Imran studied the image for a moment, then pointed at Isabella. "Your daughter?" Ernie nodded. "Isabella. She is 7. She asked me to bring her a stone from the top of the mountain." He pulled the small gray stone from his pocket, the one Captain Khan had given him, and held it in his palm. It was smooth and cold, unremarkable in every way except for where it had come from. Imran touched it with one finger, then looked back at the mountain. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out something small, a piece of folded paper worn soft at the edges. He unfolded it carefully and held it out for Ernie to see. It was a photograph, creased and faded, of a young woman holding a baby wrapped in a white cloth. The woman was smiling, her eyes bright, her face round and young. The baby's face was barely visible, a small fist pressed against the woman's cheek. "My wife," Imran said, his voice low. "My son. His name is Arshad. He was born 3 months before I came to this posting. I have not held him since he was small enough to fit in one hand." He folded the photograph carefully, the same way a man might handle something that could break, and put it back in his pocket. Ernie understood then, in a way that went beyond language, that the mountain had taken something from Imran too. Not a finger or a rib, but something deeper. The young soldier had followed them into the storm, had risked everything for strangers, because he had looked at the falling man and seen someone who needed to go home to his family. And in doing so, he had become a stranger to his own home, had made himself a man who walked toward danger instead of away from it. That was the cost of being a rescuer. It was a cost Ernie had paid for 22 years, a cost he would keep paying for the rest of his life. He put his hand on Imran's shoulder the same way Captain Khan had done on the ridge, and he did not say anything because there was nothing to say. Some things could only be held. Later that afternoon, Captain Khan gathered both teams in the largest tent. The air inside was thick with the smell of tea and the warmth of too many bodies pressed into a small space. The Pakistani soldiers sat on one side, the Filipinos on the other, but the division was no longer sharp, no longer a line that needed to be defended. Faraz, the young soldier who had fallen in the couloir, sat next to Junjun, the two of them looking at something on Junjun's phone, some video of the rice terraces that Junjun was explaining with gestures and broken English. Imran sat between Rico and Domingo, his head bowed over a cup of tea, listening as Rico told a story about a rescue on Mount Apo that involved a lost tourist, a swarm of bees, and a carabao that no one had expected to be there. The laughter that followed was not the careful, polite laughter of the first days. It was real laughter, the kind that came from deep in the chest, the kind that acknowledged that they had all seen something terrible and survived it, and that was worth celebrating. Captain Khan stood at the center of the tent, and the laughter quieted. He looked at the men around him, his face serious, and for a moment, Ernie thought he was going to give a speech, some formal acknowledgement of what had happened on the mountain. But the captain did not give a speech. Instead, he walked to the center of the tent and knelt, placing something on the ground. It was a coil of rope, bright orange, the same rope that had pulled Ernie from the crevasse, the same rope that had held them all together in the storm. It had been cleaned and coiled with care, the frayed ends trimmed, the bloodstains that would never fully come out now just dark marks on the bright fibers. Captain Khan looked at Ernie. "This rope," he said, "belongs to your team. It came from your mountains. It has been to the top of Killik and back. It has held the weight of my men and yours. I would ask that you leave it here with us so that every soldier who climbs this mountain will know what it means to hold on." He paused, then added, "But I would also ask that you take a piece of it home. A reminder. For your mountains and for ours." Ernie looked at the rope. It was just a thing, nylon and polyester, made in some factory somewhere, bought with money from a budget that was never enough. But it was also the thing that had held, the thing that had not broken when everything else was breaking. He stood, his ribs protesting, and walked to the center of the tent. He knelt beside the rope, the same way he had knelt beside Faraz, beside Alexei, beside 100 strangers who had needed someone to hold on. He ran his fingers along the orange fibers, feeling the roughness, the places where the weave had been worn thin by rock and ice. Then he took out his knife, the same knife he had carried for 22 years, the same knife that had cut rope and food in the straps of broken packs. He cut a length of the rope about 2 feet long and held it in his hands. Then he cut another length and another until he had 7 pieces, one for each of his men. He handed one to Rico, one to Junjun, one to Domingo, one to each of the Filipinos who had followed him into the white. Then he took the remaining coil and placed it back in the center of the tent, in front of Captain Khan. "This rope belongs to all of us now," he said. His voice was rough, still raw from the storm, but it carried. It came from the Philippines, but it found its home here. Keep it. Let your men see it. Let them touch it. Let them know that a rope does not care where you are from. It only cares that you hold on. He looked at Imran, who was watching him with eyes that were bright, too bright. And let them know that when you hold on, you are not just holding on to the rope. You are holding on to each other. There was silence in the tent, the kind of silence that was not empty but full, heavy with everything that could not be said. Then Faraz began to clap. It was a small sound at first, tentative, but then Junjun joined, and Rico and Imran, and then all of them, the sound of 20 hands coming together in the thin air of the Karakoram, a sound that was not quite applause and not quite celebration, but something older, something that had been happening in campfires and tents and shelters since the first humans looked at a mountain and decided to climb it anyway. That night, Ernie could not sleep. He lay in his tent, the piece of orange rope coiled beside his cot, the gray stone in his pocket, the photo of Luz and Isabella on his chest. Outside, the wind had returned, but it was not the wind of the storm. It was a gentle wind, a wind that whispered instead of screamed, a wind that seemed to carry voices from somewhere far away. He thought he heard Luz's voice, the way she called his name when he came home from a rescue, a note of relief that she never let show in front of Isabella. He thought he heard Isabella's voice, her laughter, the way she sang songs in the shower, off-key and happy. And he thought he heard other voices, voices he did not know, voices that spoke in languages he did not understand but somehow knew. A woman's voice calling for Imran. A baby's cry, the sound of new life. A man's voice, Russian, thanking someone he would never meet. The mountain was letting them go. It had tested them, taken its measure of their blood and fear and courage, and now it was releasing them back to the world below, back to the lives they had almost left behind. He sat up, the movement slow, careful of his ribs. He pulled on his boots and his jacket and stepped out of the tent. The camp was quiet, the tents dark, the only light the cold fire of the stars above. He walked to the edge of the camp, to the place where he had sat with Imran earlier, and looked up at Kilik. The mountain was a black shape against the stars, its summit invisible, its flanks lost in shadow. It looked different now. Not smaller, not less dangerous, but known. It was a mountain that had tried to kill him and had failed, and in the failing, had given him something he would carry for the rest of his life. Not just the stone, not just the rope, but something that did not have a name, something that lived in the space between his ribs where the broken bones were healing, something that would ache when he thought of it, the way frostbitten fingers ached in the cold. He heard footsteps behind him and did not turn. Imran came to stand beside him, his breath pluming in the cold air, his face turned toward the mountain as well. For a long time they stood together, two men from opposite ends of the world, watching the darkness where their fear and their courage had been tested. Then Imran spoke, his voice barely a whisper. When I was on the ice holding the rope, I thought I was going to fall. I thought this is where I die. And then I thought of my son. I thought he will grow up without a father. He will know my name from a photograph, the way I knew my father's name from a photograph. And I was angry for a moment, angry that I had followed you into the storm, angry that I had left my son for this. He paused, his voice catching. And then I saw your face. You were coming up from the crevasse, and your hand reached for mine, and your eyes were not afraid. They were not angry. They were just there, holding. And I thought, this man has a daughter. He has someone waiting for him too. And I pulled. I pulled because if I let go of you, I was letting go of myself. I was letting go of my son. He turned to look at Ernie, and in the starlight, his face was young, younger than Ernie had ever seen it. You taught me that, Damajaba. You taught me that holding on is not weakness. It is the only thing that makes us strong. Ernie did not know what to say. He had never been good with words, had always let his hands do the talking, his grip, his rope, his presence on the mountain when everything else was falling apart. But now, standing in the cold with this young man who had followed him into death and back, he found something he did not know he had. He put his hand on Imran's shoulder, the same way he had done 100 times, and he pulled the young soldier into an embrace. It was awkward, two men who were not used to this, their bodies stiff, their arms uncertain. But they held on. They held on the way they had held on to the rope, the way they had held on to each other in the storm, the way they would hold on to this moment for the rest of their lives. When they pulled apart, there were no words. There did not need to be. The mountain watched, silent, and the stars burned on, and two men who had been strangers a week ago stood together in the darkness, bound by something that no storm could ever break. The trucks came for them on the 5th day. Ernie heard them long before he saw them, the distant rumble of engines climbing the winding road from Skardu, a sound that belonged to the world below, the world of paved roads and electricity and signal towers that could carry a voice across oceans. He was standing at the edge of the camp, his pack packed, his gear checked and rechecked, the small gray stone tucked into the inner pocket of his jacket where it rested against his heart. The piece of orange rope was coiled in his pack, but he had kept a smaller piece, a few inches long, that he had tied around his wrist like a bracelet. It was already becoming a part of him, the rough fibers rubbing against his skin, a reminder of what had happened on the mountain. The frostbite on his fingers had healed to a dull pink, the skin still tender, but the doctors had cleared him to travel. The ribs would take longer, but ribs healed. Everything healed, eventually. The camp was alive with movement, tents coming down, gear being loaded, the easy chaos of departure that was always tinged with something that felt like loss. The Pakistani soldiers moved among the Filipinos, helping with the packs, sharing cups of tea that seemed to last longer than necessary, finding reasons to delay the moment when they would have to say goodbye. Faraz had attached a small pin to Junjun's pack, a pin shaped like the star and crescent of the Pakistani flag, and Junjun had given Faraz a wooden keychain he had bought in Manila, a small carving of a carabao that Faraz was turning over and over in his hand, looking at it like it was made of gold. Domingo was exchanging contact information with a Pakistani soldier named Tariq, the two of them writing numbers and addresses on scraps of paper, promising to call, to write, to remember. Rico was sitting with Imran, the two of them leaning against a rock, not talking, just sitting, the way men sit when they have said everything that needs to be said and are not ready to say goodbye. Captain Khan found Ernie by the edge of the camp. The captain was in his full uniform now, the crisp, pressed uniform of a man who was returning to his post, to his duties, to the life he had left behind when he walked onto the mountain. But there was something different in his face, something that had not been there on the first day. The walls were still there, the discipline, the control, but behind them something had softened. He held out his hand, the same hand he had extended on that first night, but now it was not a test. It was a farewell. Ernie took it, and the two men stood for a moment, their hands clasped, the way two captains might stand, two leaders who had brought their men through the storm and were now bringing them home. "You will come back," Captain Khan said. It was not a question. Ernie shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "My wife would kill me. She has not said it yet, but I can hear it in her voice when we talk. She is going to tell me that I am too old for this, that I should stay in Baguio, that the mountains are for young men." Captain Khan smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his stern face into something almost gentle. "And what will you tell her?" Ernie looked at the mountain, at Killick, standing silent and white against the blue sky. "I will tell her that I am too old for this. And then I will wait for the next call. Because that is what we do. That is what we are." The trucks arrived in a cloud of dust, their engines idling, their drivers waiting to carry them down from the high camp to Skardu, to the airfield, to the planes that would take the Filipinos home. The loading was quick, too quick, the packs tossed into the truck beds, the men climbing up after them, finding places on the wooden benches that lined the sides. Ernie was one of the last to climb up. He stood at the tailgate, looking back at the camp, at the tents that were now just dark shapes on the gray rock, at the path that led up into the mountains, at the peak of Killick, hidden now by the lower ridges. He thought of the voice in the storm, the voice that had called him away from the rope. He thought of the crevasse, the fall, the moment when his hand had found Imran's wrist and held. He thought of the orange rope, coiled now in Captain Khan's tent, waiting for the next team, the next rescue, the next moment when someone would need to hold on. He climbed into the truck. The ride down was rough, the truck bouncing over rocks and ruts, the dust rising in clouds that coated everything, that found its way into their mouths and their eyes and the creases of their clothes. But no one complained. The men were quiet, each lost in their own thoughts, their own memories of the days that had passed. Junjun was leaning against his pack, his eyes closed, his hand resting on the pin Faraz had given him. Rico was looking out the back of the truck, watching the mountain recede, his face calm, his eyes distant. Imran was not in the truck with them. The Pakistani soldiers had their own transport, their own route back to their barracks. The goodbyes had been said at the camp, quick and awkward, the way men say goodbye when they do not want to cry. Ernie had gripped Imran's hand one last time, had looked into the young soldier's eyes, had said, "Arshad, your son. He will be proud of you. When he is old enough to understand, tell him about the mountain. Tell him about the rope. Tell him that his father held on." Imran had nodded, unable to speak, and then he had turned and walked away, his shoulders straight, his head high, a soldier returning to his duty. Ernie had watched him go, and he had felt something break in his chest that was not a rib, something that would heal slowly if it healed at all. The town of Skardu appeared out of the dust like a mirage, low buildings of mud and stone, streets that were alive with people and animals and the constant, chaotic motion of a place that was the last outpost of civilization before the mountains. The truck stopped at a small compound, a guest house that had been prepared for the Filipino team, and they climbed down, their legs stiff, their bodies aching from the long ride. There was hot water waiting and clean clothes and beds that did not move with every gust of wind. Ernie stood under the shower for a long time, letting the water run over him, watching it turn brown with the dust of the mountain, then gray, then clear. He looked at his hands, at the healing fingers, at the orange bracelet tied around his wrist, and he wondered if he would ever feel clean again. Not his body. His body would heal. But the mountain was in him now, the way it was in all of them, a thing that would not wash off, a thing that would live in the space between his ribs until the day he died. That evening they were taken to a small restaurant, a place that served the food of the region, rice and lamb and flatbread that was hot from the oven. The owner had heard about the rescue, had heard about the Filipinos who had gone into the storm and come out with a Russian climber, and he treated them like heroes, bringing out dish after dish, refusing to let them pay. Ernie ate slowly, savoring the food, listening to the laughter of his men as they told stories of the mountain, the stories already becoming legends, already changing in the telling. Faraz had fallen twice as far in the stories, the crevasse had been twice as deep, the storm had lasted twice as long. But that was what stories were for. They were not lies. They were the truth made into something that could be carried, something that could be told to children, something that would last. After the meal, they walked back to the guest house through streets that were quiet now. The noise of the day settled into the soft murmur of a town at rest. Ernie looked up at the sky. The stars were the same as they had been on the mountain, the same impossible brightness, the same cold fire. But here, in the town, They seemed farther away, less immediate, as if the mountain had brought them close and now the world was pushing them back to their proper distance. He thought of Luz waiting for him. He thought of Isabella who would be asleep now, her hand clutching her stuffed rabbit, her dreams full of the things that 7-year-olds dream about. He thought of the stone in his pocket, the stone that had waited for him at the edge of the crevasse, the stone that would sit on Isabella's shelf and remind her that her father had gone to the top of the world and come back. The next morning they were taken to the airfield. The plane was small, a propeller aircraft that would carry them to Islamabad, where a larger plane would take them to Manila. The sky was clear, the air cold but bright, the mountains visible in the distance, a wall of white and gray that marked the edge of the world. Ernie stood on the tarmac, his pack at his feet, and watched the mountains as the sun rose behind them, painting their peaks in shades of gold and pink. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned. It was Captain Khan. The captain had come to see them off, his uniform immaculate, his face composed, but his eyes were red as if he had not slept. He was holding something in his hand, a small cloth bag, embroidered with the patterns of the region. He pressed it into Ernie's hands. "For your daughter," he said. "A gift from the mountain. From us." Ernie opened the bag and found a small stone inside, similar to the one he had found, but this one had been carved, polished, shaped into a small heart. It was smooth and cool in his palm, a piece of the Karakoram that had been transformed by human hands into something beautiful. "Tell her," Captain Khan said, "that there are mountains in Pakistan that will always remember her father. Tell her that she has brothers here if she ever needs them." Ernie closed his hand around the stone heart, the stone from the mountain, and he felt the tears come. He did not try to stop them. He was too old to be ashamed of tears, too tired to pretend that he was not moved. He took Captain Khan's hand, and then he pulled the captain into an embrace, the same embrace he had shared with Imran, the same embrace that men give when words are not enough. The captain stiffened for a moment, surprised, and then he relaxed, his arms coming up to return the embrace. They stood like that for a long moment, two men who had led their teams through the storm, who had seen the worst that the mountain could offer and had not broken. Then they pulled apart and Captain Khan stepped back, his composure restored but his eyes still bright. "Go home, Damajiba. Your daughter is waiting." Ernie nodded, unable to speak, and picked up his pack. He walked toward the plane, his men following behind him, and he did not look back. He could not. If he looked back he would not leave. The plane took off with a roar that shook the small cabin, the wheels leaving the ground, the mountains dropping away beneath them. Ernie looked out the window, watching the peaks shrink, the valleys narrow, the world of rock and ice giving way to the brown and green of the lower lands. He saw Killik for a moment, a brief glimpse of its summit before a cloud covered it, and then it was gone, lost in the vastness of the range. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. Beside him, Rico was already asleep, his face relaxed, the piece of orange rope visible at his wrist. Across the aisle, Junjun was looking out the window, his face young but not young anymore, his eyes carrying something that had not been there a week ago. They were all different now. The mountain had changed them, had taken something and given something, had left its mark on each of them in ways that would take years to understand. The flight to Islamabad was long, the plane small, the air bumpy as they crossed the lower ranges. Ernie slept, woke, slept again, his dreams full of snow and ice and the sound of a voice calling in the storm. When he woke for the last time, the mountains were gone, replaced by the flat brown of the plains, the green of the irrigated fields, the sprawl of the city appearing on the horizon. Islamabad was a blur of traffic and noise, of buildings and roads and the constant, insistent hum of a world that did not know about the mountain, did not know about the storm, did not know about the men who had held on when holding on was the only thing that mattered. They were taken to a hotel, given rooms, told to rest. Their flight to Manila was the next morning. Ernie lay on the bed, the ceiling fan turning slowly above him, and listened to the sounds of the city. It was strange, this sudden return to the world of people and cars and phones that worked. He had a phone now, a working phone, a phone that could call Luz. But he did not call. He was not ready. He needed one more night with the mountain still close, still real, before he became the man who came home from a trip, who told stories that would become smaller and smaller with each telling, who put the stone on his daughter's shelf and tried to explain what it meant. In the morning they went to the airport. The terminal was crowded, full of people moving in every direction, the noise of announcements and trolleys and children crying filling the space. They checked their bags, went through security, found their gate. The plane that would take them to Manila was large, a wide-body jet that seemed impossibly big after the small propeller plane that had brought them from Skardu. They boarded with the other passengers, found their seats, settled in for the long flight. Ernie had a window seat, and as the plane taxied to the runway, he looked out at the sky, at the clouds that hung low over the city, at the distant hills that were the last echo of the mountains he had left behind. The plane took off, lifting into the air, turning east toward home. He watched the land fall away beneath him, the green and brown of Pakistan, the rivers that snaked through the valleys, the roads that led to places he would never see. And then there was only cloud, white and soft, and he leaned his head back and let the hum of the engines carry him toward his wife, toward his daughter, toward the life that was waiting for him at the other end of the sky. The photograph was not taken by any of them. That was the strange thing about it, the thing that would be told and retold until it became part of the story, part of the legend that grew up around the men who had walked into the storm on Killik. It was taken by a Pakistani army photographer, a young corporal named Bilal who had been stationed at base camp to document the training exchange. He had been in the mess tent when the storm hit, had watched the radio crackle with Captain Khan's voice, had listened to the hours of silence that followed, the silence that made everyone think the worst. He had been there when the rescue team came down from the mountain, the stretcher with the Russian climber, the Filipinos and the Pakistanis stumbling into camp, their faces gray with exhaustion, their clothes frozen stiff, their hands raw and bleeding. He had raised his camera without thinking, the way a photographer does when something happens that cannot be described in words. He had taken one photograph. Just one. And then he had put his camera down and helped carry the stretcher to the medical tent. The photograph sat on a memory card for 3 days. Bilal did not look at it, did not think about it, too busy helping with the recovery, the debriefings, the long process of bringing everyone back from the edge of what they had survived. It was not until the Filipino team had left, not until the camp was quiet again and the tents were packed and the mountain had returned to its ancient silence, that he sat down with his laptop and transferred the images from the memory card. He scrolled through the photos from the training exchange, the early days when the Filipinos and Pakistanis were still strangers, the awkward smiles, the formal handshakes, the careful distance between two groups who did not yet know each other. And then he reached the photograph. He stopped. He stared at the screen for a long time, his finger frozen on the keyboard, his breath caught in his chest. He had not known, when he pressed the shutter, that he was capturing something that would leave his hands, that would travel across oceans, that would land on screens in living rooms and offices and cafes around the world, that would make strangers weep without knowing why. The photograph was simple. That was why it worked. It showed the moment of arrival at base camp, the figures emerging from the white haze of the storm, the orange rope still connecting them, still holding them together. In the center of the frame was a Filipino man, his face turned toward the camera, his eyes wide with exhaustion and something else, something that looked like wonder. His hands were raised, and in his hands was a Pakistani soldier, the two men gripping each other's wrists, their fingers locked, their arms straining, the orange rope coiled between them. Behind them, the storm was still visible, a wall of white that seemed to be reaching for them, trying to pull them back. But they were through it. They were here. They were holding on. The photograph had no caption, no explanation, no names. It was just two men, a rope, and a storm. And it was enough. It was more than enough. Bilal posted the photograph on his personal social media account, a casual thing, a way to share what he had seen with his friends and family. He wrote a simple caption: "These men came down from the mountain today. They saved a life. They are heroes." He did not think about it again. He went to sleep, exhausted, and woke to a world that had changed. His phone was vibrating, a constant, relentless buzz that would not stop. His messages were full, his notifications overflowing, his account flooded with comments and shares and likes that had climbed into the thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The photograph had left his hands. It was on Twitter now, on Facebook, on Instagram, on news sites that had picked it up from someone who had picked it up from someone else. It was being shared in Manila and Islamabad and New York and London and Tokyo. It was being shared by people who did not know the names of the men in the photograph, who did not know the mountain or the storm or the crevasse or the voice in the white. But they did not need to know. They saw two men holding on to each other in the middle of a storm, and they understood something. They understood that somewhere in the world, in a place they would never visit, two men had chosen to hold on instead of letting go. And that was a thing worth sharing. The news reached the Philippines before Ernie did. His plane was still somewhere over the South China Sea when the photograph appeared on the front page of a Manila newspaper, when a television station ran a segment about the Filipino mountain rescuers who had braved a storm in the Karakoram to save a Russian climber, when the story began to spread through the neighborhoods and the villages and the mountains of the Cordilleras. Luz saw it on the television in their small house in Baguio. She was sitting on the couch, Isabella curled beside her, the evening news playing while she waited for the call that would tell her her husband was safe. The screen showed the photograph, and the anchor's voice said the words Ernesto de Majiba, and Filipino mountain rescuer, and hero. Luz did not hear the rest. She was looking at the photograph, at her husband's face, at his hands gripping the wrists of a man she did not know, at the storm behind them, and she was crying. Not the quiet tears she had cried when he left, the tears she hid from Isabella, but the loud, shaking tears of a woman who had been holding her breath for 2 weeks and had finally been told she could breathe. Isabella looked at the screen, at her father's face, and she did not understand why her mother was crying. She understood later. She would understand for the rest of her life. Ernie landed in Manila on a Tuesday afternoon. The plane taxied to the gate, the seatbelt sign went off, the passengers began to gather their bags and shuffle toward the exits. He stood, his ribs aching, his hands stiff, his pack heavy on his shoulders, and he walked down the aisle toward the door. When he stepped into the terminal, he was met by a crowd. Not just Rico and Junjun and the other men from his team, who had gone ahead on the earlier flights. Not just the officials from the Department of Tourism, who had arranged the exchange and were now eager to take credit for its success. But reporters, cameras, microphones. People he did not know, people who wanted to shake his hand, to take his photograph, to ask him questions about the mountain, about the storm, about the photograph that had made him famous while he was still in the air. He stopped, confused, overwhelmed, and turned to Rico, who was standing beside him, a grin spreading across his tired face. "You have not seen it, Manong," Rico said. "You have not seen what they are saying about us." He held out his phone, the screen showing the photograph that had been seen by millions of people, the photograph that had turned 2 men into a symbol. Ernie stared at the screen. He saw himself, his face gray with exhaustion, his eyes wide, his hands gripping the wrists of a man he had known for less than a week. He saw Imran, his face half turned away, his body leaning into the grip, the orange rope coiled between them. He saw the storm behind them, the white wall that they had walked through, the white wall that had almost swallowed them. And he understood, in a way that he had not understood on the mountain, what they had done. It was not just a rescue. It was not just a climb. It was something that had reached across the world, something that had touched people who would never see the Karakoram, who would never hold a rope in a storm, who would never know what it felt like to stand on the edge of a crevasse and reach for a stranger's hand. It was a photograph, and it was more than a photograph. It was a message. It was a message that said, "We are not alone. We do not have to be alone. There are people in this world who will hold on." He did the interviews. He answered the questions. He told the story of the mountain and the storm and the crevasse and the voice that had called him away from the rope. He told it simply, the way he told all stories, with his hands moving, with his eyes on the faces of the people asking, with the orange bracelet on his wrist catching the light. He talked about Faraz, the young soldier who had fallen in the couloir, and about Junjun, the boy who had become a man in the snow. He talked about Captain Khan, who had come back for them when the storm was at its worst, who had refused to let any of his men be left behind. And he talked about Imran. He talked about the young soldier with the thin mustache and the skeptical eyes, the soldier who had followed him into the storm, who had held the rope at the edge of the crevasse, who had pulled him back from the white. He talked about Imran's son, Arshad, who was waiting for his father to come home. He talked about the photograph and what it meant and why it had touched so many people. "It is not about me," he said, his voice rough, his eyes wet. "It is about the rope. It is about what happens when people decide to hold on. That is all. That is everything." He was allowed to go home that night. The officials wanted to keep him, to host a dinner, to arrange more interviews, to capitalize on the attention that was flooding in from around the world. But Ernie said no. He had been away for too long. He had a wife waiting, a daughter waiting, a life that had been paused while he climbed a mountain on the other side of the world. He took a car, a small sedan that drove through the streets of Manila, through the traffic and the lights and the noise, toward the north, toward the mountains that were not the Karakoram but were his mountains, the mountains where he had learned to climb, to hold, to be. The drive was long, hours of darkness broken by the lights of towns and the dark shapes of hills, and he slept for most of it, his head against the window, his hand resting on the pocket where the stone heart was tucked against his chest. He dreamed of the mountain, of the crevasse, of the moment when his hand found Imran's wrist and held. And then he dreamed of Luz, of her face when she saw him, of her hands reaching for him, of her voice saying his name, and he woke to the lights of Baguio, the familiar streets, the cool air that smelled of pine and rain. The car stopped outside his house. It was a small house, the house he had built with his own hands, the house where Isabella had taken her first steps, where Luz had cooked 1,000 meals, where the bolo from his grandmother sat on a shelf by the door, watching over them. The lights were on, all of them, and the door was open, and Luz was standing in the doorway, her hands at her sides, her face wet with tears. She had seen the photograph. She had seen her husband's face on the television, on the phones of neighbors, on the front page of the newspaper that was still lying on the kitchen table. She had waited and she had prayed, and now he was here. Ernie walked toward her, his legs heavy, his ribs aching, his hands trembling. He did not run. He could not run. He walked, and with each step the mountain receded a little, the storm faded a little, the cold that had settled into his bones began to thaw. When he reached her, he stopped. He looked at her face, the face he had carried with him through every hour of darkness, the face that had been waiting for him at the end of every rescue, every climb, every long night away from home. He opened his arms and she stepped into them, and they held each other the way they had always held each other, the way they would always hold each other, the way people hold on when they have learned that letting go is not an option. Isabella was behind her mother, peeking out from the doorway, her eyes wide, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. She was 7 years old, and she had been waiting for this moment for 2 weeks, and now that it was here, she did not know what to do. Ernie knelt, the pain in his ribs sharp but ignored, and opened his arms to her. She ran. She ran across the threshold, across the small porch, into her father's arms, and she held him, her small hands gripping his jacket, her face buried in his shoulder, her body shaking with the sobs that she had been holding in since the day he left. He held her, his hands gentle on her back, his voice low and steady, the same voice he had used on Faraz, on Alexei, on himself in the darkness of the crevasse. "I am here, Anik. I am home. I am not going anywhere." He pulled the stone heart from his pocket, the one Captain Khan had given him, the one that had traveled across oceans, and he placed it in her small hand. "This is for you. From the mountain. From a man I met there. He has a son, a boy named Arshad, and he asked me to give this to you, to remind you that your father is strong, that your father came home." Isabella looked at the stone heart, her tears still falling, her fingers closing around it, and she nodded, not understanding everything but understanding enough. She understood that her father was home. That was all that mattered. The days that followed were a blur of interviews and ceremonies, of medals and certificates, of strangers wanting to shake his hand and tell him that he was a hero. Ernie accepted it all with the same quiet patience he brought to everything, but his mind was elsewhere. His mind was on the mountain, on the men he had left behind, on the orange rope that was coiled in Captain Khan's tent, on the photograph that was still spreading across the world, touching people he would never meet. He received a message from Imran, a long message in English that must have taken the young soldier hours to write, the words careful, the sentences simple. "My brother," it began, and Ernie's eyes filled with tears before he read the rest. "My brother, I have seen the photograph. I have seen what the world is saying. They say we are heroes. But I know what we are. We are men who held on. That is enough for me. That is more than enough. I have told Arshad about you. He is too young to understand, but one day he will know. He will know that his father had a brother in the Philippines, a brother who taught him what it means to hold on. I will never forget you. I will never forget the rope. I will never forget the moment when your hand found mine. You are my family now. Wherever you are, whatever you do, you are my family." Ernie read the message 3 times, and then he called Luz into the room and he read it to her, and they cried together, not because they were sad, but because they had learned that tears were sometimes the only way to hold something that was too big for words. The story did not end there, of course. Stories like this do not end. They become part of the people they touch, the way the mountain had become part of Ernie, the way the rope had become part of his hand, the way the photograph had become part of the world. He went back to work, back to the mountains of the Cordilleras, back to the rescues and the trainings and the long nights waiting for the call. But he was different now. The men who worked with him saw it, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he looked at the mountains with something that was not quite respect and not quite fear, but something that held both. He kept the orange bracelet on his wrist, and when new recruits asked him about it, he told them the story. He told them about Kilik, about the storm, about the crevasse, about the young Pakistani soldier who had held the rope when everything else was letting go. He told them about the photograph and about what it meant to be a rescuer, and about the thing he had learned on that mountain, the thing that had taken him 22 years to understand. "We are not heroes," he would say, his voice quiet, his eyes on the mountains. "We are just men who hold on. That is all. That is everything. And when you hold on, when you really hold on, you find that you are not alone. There is always someone else holding on with you. Sometimes you can see them. Sometimes you cannot. But they are there. They are always there." The photograph continued to spread. It was shared on the anniversary of the rescue, on the birthdays of the men in the image, On the days when the world seemed dark and people needed to see something that reminded them that light existed. It was printed and framed, hung on the walls of rescue stations in the Philippines and Pakistan, a reminder of what was possible when strangers chose to become brothers. It was shown in schools, in training sessions, in the briefings that new soldiers and new rescuers attended before they were sent into the mountains. It became a symbol the way some photographs do, not because of the quality of the image or the skill of the photographer, but because of the truth it carried. It was a truth that did not need words. It was a truth that was visible in the grip of two hands, in the orange rope that held them together, in the storm that was still reaching for them, still trying to pull them back. They were holding. They were not letting go. And that was enough to make the whole world stop and look. Ernie did not know at first that the photograph had reached the village where Imran lived, a small town in the Punjab, where Imran's wife had seen it on a neighbor's phone and had wept the same way Luz had wept, her son Arshad in her arms, her husband's face on a screen, a face she had not seen in months. He did not know that the photograph had been printed and framed and placed on the wall of the village school, that the children who studied there would grow up seeing those two men, that they would learn the story of the mountain and the storm and the rope, that they would carry it with them the way Ernie carried the stone in his pocket. He did not know that, years later, a young man named Arshad would stand in front of that photograph and ask his mother about the man in the orange rope, the man who was not his father but was somehow part of his father, and that his mother would tell him the story, the whole story, the story that had been waiting for him since before he was born. He did not know these things, not yet. But he would. He would learn them in the years to come, in the messages that traveled across oceans, in the visits that would happen one day, in the moment when a young Pakistani man would come to the Cordilleras, would knock on his door, would introduce himself as the son of Havildar Imran, and would say, "My father told me to find you. He told me to tell you that he never let go." But that was later. For now, Ernie sat on the porch of his small house in Baguio, the cool air of the mountains settling around him, the stars coming out one by one. Luz was inside, her voice drifting through the open window as she sang a song to Isabella, the same song she had sung to her when she was a baby, the same song that had carried Ernie through the nights when he was away. He looked at his hands, at the healing fingers, at the orange bracelet that had faded to a soft, worn color, at the scars that would never fully disappear. He thought of the mountain, of the storm, of the crevasse, of the voice that had called him away from the rope. He thought of Imran, of the photograph, of the millions of people who had seen it and had seen something in it that they needed to see. He thought of the stone heart in Isabella's room, the stone that had come from the other side of the world, the stone that had waited for him at the edge of the crevasse. He thought of the rope, the orange rope that had held them all together, that was still holding them together, that would hold them together for the rest of their lives. He closed his eyes and he let the mountain go. Not because he had forgotten it. He would never forget it. But because he was home. He was home and his wife was singing and his daughter was sleeping and the stars were out and the world was still turning and he was alive. He was alive and he was holding on. And that was everything.